Hello there. To put it bluntly, in order for Jeremy Corbyn to deliver the Labour Party manifesto in full, the UK would need to leave the EU in full. Now firstly, if you do like my videos and want to help spread the message, please remember to like them. That helps drive the YouTube algorithm. Now all those of you who are hoping that a vote for Jeremy Corbyn and his Labour Party will somehow deliver the UK into a new age of socialism need to remove those rose-tinted spectacles and look at the reality of the situation. Because there is no way this free stuff promising Father Christmas figure of the left can deliver anything of his Marxist substance while we remain connected in any way to the European Union. And let's start with the Labour Party official Brexit policy then, shall we? What exactly is it promising? Well, it's a far cry from promising the complete and unequivocal withdrawal from the European Union, isn't it? Jeremy Corbyn would have you believe that if he gets into number 10, first he would negotiate a whole new deal with the EU by the 12th of March 2020, which on past statements of his and his team would include at least a new customs union and a really tight level playing field with all EU rules and regulations. And we all know what that means, don't we? It means that it's just a Brexit in name only. Nothing more. In fact, it's more like a nabber, not a Brexit at all. And then secondly, his Brexit plan is promising on or before the 12th of June 2020 that we would be holding a referendum to choose between his negotiated not having a Brexit at all or just revoking the Article 50 letter and remaining in the EU. And after that, his plan is to then go full tilt into delivering his hard left Marxist programme to turn our country into the UK SSR, the UK Soviet Socialist Republic. But he's also added some later spending commitments and pledges into an already costed, his side claims, manifesto. So we have no idea where the money's coming from. Well, we do really, don't we? It would have to come from more borrowing and more tax that he hasn't yet told us about. And just for starters, he will be taking huge swathes of businesses into public ownership, forcing companies to relinquish shares in exchange for government bonds, ensuring that ordinary people pass on as much of their wealth to the state when they die as possible, as opposed to the people they choose to leave it to, tax people's property more, tax people more, tax wealth creation companies more, tax entrepreneurship. The list goes on. Now you have to remember that as far as the hard left is concerned, working hard to earn and store personal wealth and assets is a crime against the state. All work, to them, must be directed to filling the coffers of a huge state machine from which a few pennies will be returned to you, if you are deemed by your words and actions to be a worthy state pleb. So those assets squirreled away by those that graft have to be hunted down and stripped from their owners and handed over to the people. But you only have to look at past history, and some of it quite recent, to see how ludicrous and damaging that whole concept is. Damaging on a political level, an economic level, and to some on a physical level. Corbyn would also align this country with some very, very nasty bedfellows. Anyway, how do Corbyn's plans for a grand socialist utopia stack up with what the EU would actually allow us to do? Well, writing in Brexit Central, Joshua Mackenzie-Laurie explains it all quite neatly. And the answer is that Corbyn's post-Brexit dreams are just that, dreams, because while we're tied to the EU in any form, his plans can never come to fruition. And one prime example of this is Corbyn's pledge to spend an unsupported almost £60 billion on the WASPy women. This was a later addition to Corbyn's promises, and he's admitted that the money would have to be raised through bond issuance, i.e. racking up the national debt. But not only that, if the UK stays closely aligned to the EU in the way he wishes, or even inside the EU as a full member after his second EU referendum, then this policy would almost certainly not be allowed under EU law. As Mackenzie Laurie points out in his article, the reason the WASPy women are in this position is because of EU law that forces the UK to equalise the state pension age of men and women. And further, under EU law it would be unlawful to repay those involved. So to fulfil that commitment, Corbyn would first have to remove the UK from the EU. Now, the legislation that Mackenzie Laurie points to is the Council Directive 79/7/EEC of the 19th of December 1978 on the progressive implementation of the principle of equal treatment for men and women in matters of social security. Now, this was signed off in December 1978, and member states had 6 years to comply with it. So since at least December 1984, as I can see, the UK has had a duty to bring the state pensionable ages for men and women into line. Now, looking back, since the Pensions Act 1995, a series of laws has been put into place to end with everyone having the same pensionable age of 67, I think, by 2044. But the WASPy women believe that they were informed too late in the day, and the changes made too quickly for them to make plans to address what they regard as a pensions gap. But there is also another side to this. If the WASPy women get this money, then those men who were forced to work until 65 or beyond before they got the state pension could use EU equality law to make their own claim, as men and women must be treated equally. So if women get compensation for not receiving the pension after, say, the age of 60, then men of the same age should surely get the same exact amount of compensation. And that would potentially more than double the £60 billion bill. Except that men die younger, so there won't be as many of them about to claim, of course. So the only way to give the WASPy women that money without being liable to the men would be to leave the European Union. And on nationalisation of utilities, mail and rail, Mackenzie Laurie points out in his piece that Mr Corbyn's plan to seize parts of private companies with minimal compensation given to shareholders goes against the right to protection of property as set out in law in the ECHR. Because under the ECHR, the government has to pay proper market prices for anything they buy through legal compulsion. And many would not regard being compelled to take government bonds in exchange for shares bought through choice as a fair market price. So if we were still tied to the EU, Corbyn's Labour government would be forced to pay properly for all the assets it bought, making the taxpayers' eyes water even more. Then there's the EU state aid rules that could well fetter how a Labour government could operate any nationalised industry. That would mean that they could actually buy it, but would probably have to run it like we already do run the roads and railways. In order to run those industries as fully state-owned and operated might well be a step too far for Brussels. So for me, on the face of it, Labour's manifesto looks utterly meaningless, and I wonder if Jeremy Corbyn knows it. That leaves one obvious question: is Jeremy Corbyn deliberately misleading the general public? Now, not mentioning any names, but this would not be the first time in recent history that a Labour leader has taken the path of misleading the public and Parliament on a grand scale. Let's condense this into one sentence. Labour's manifesto plans look largely unlawful whilst the UK remains in the EU or even connected closely to it. So is this why a lifelong Eurosceptic like Jeremy Corbyn has chosen to remain neutral on Brexit whilst he leads a predominantly pro-EU party? So he can then blame his inability to deliver those Marxist promises on the EU and/or on the Brexit plan his party negotiates. Because when it comes to the EU, the ideological gulf between Jeremy Corbyn and his party is as big as Diane Abbott's calculator, and has an ironic juxtaposition at the level of having a Nick Griffin as the leader of Antifa and Nick Clegg fronting UKIP. In fact, the more I think about it, to enable Corbyn to fulfil his party's manifesto commitments would probably require a harder Brexit than the Boris Johnson one those Labour supporters are bleating about. Either that, or we'd end up in a roundabout of EU legal actions taking us through the courts via Article 7 of the Treaty on the European Union for non-compliance, at great expense to us and potential suspension of voting rights, etc. But sadly there's no mechanism for actually expelling a non-conforming member state from the EU. Now our Jeremy has been at this game for decades, and he has ranks of advisors around him, so they know all this stuff. So for me, the prima facie evidence is that Corbyn and the Labour Party are telling big fat porkies, hoping no one will either care or check, and that it'll all work out for them in the end as long as enough people think they'll be getting free stuff that they're told they're entitled to receive at other people's expense. And once in, Corbyn probably calculates that all those promises and pledges can be quietly and safely dropped because of the short attention span of the UK public. Especially if they're all working doubly hard just to pay all those eye-watering taxes so that money can be splurged around the world. Or wondering what to do next because everyone's on strike, there's no power and no food on the shelves. I say keep those charlatans as far away from Westminster as you can. Anyway, what do you think? Please share and comment, and thank you for watching.